Welcome back to the channel. You are about to dive into She Was Abandoned at the Altar, but Claimed by the Rival Alpha, a story of time loops, revenge, and fated mates. Before we start the clock on the 100th loop, please take a quick second to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a chapter. I love seeing how far our stories travel, so pause for just a moment and comment down below, telling me where you are listening from today. And as we go through the story, don't be shy. I want to see your reactions in the comments. Let me know which scene is your favorite or the exact moment you fell in love with the story. Ready? Let's begin. Imagine dying on your wedding day. Now imagine doing it 99 times. Myron Vance doesn't have to imagine. For a century of lifetimes, she has stood in the Gilded Ridge Chapel, listened to Alpha Alden reject her, and watched the world burn in the aftermath. She has tried running. She has tried fighting. She has tried begging. The result is always the same: apocalypse, death, and waking up to the alarm at 8 a.m. But today is cycle 100. Today, Maren is done fighting fate. She is ready to close her eyes and let the fire take her. She has memorized the script of her own demise perfectly. She just doesn't know that today, someone else has decided to rewrite it. Chapter 1. The 100th morning. The digital alarm clock buzzed with a sound that felt like a drill boring directly into the center of Maren's skull. She didn't open her eyes immediately because she didn't need to. She knew exactly what she would see. The sunlight was cutting through the east window at a 45-degree angle, illuminating dust motes that had been dancing in the same pattern for 100 lifetimes. The room temperature was exactly 68 degrees. Outside, a robin was about to chirp 3 times before flying away. Maren reached out and silenced the alarm a split second before her mother, Elise, would inevitably burst through the bedroom door. The handle turned with a familiar rattle, and the door swung open to reveal Elise, breathless and beaming, clutching a silk robe as if it were a royal standard. She launched into the monologue Maren could recite backward in her sleep, her voice pitching high with manic excitement about this being the most important day of Maren's life. Maren sat up, the sheets pooling around her waist, and stared at the woman who had died screaming in 99 different timelines. It was difficult to muster the appropriate enthusiasm when you were essentially a ghost haunting your own living body. Maren simply nodded, her expression carved from stone, and swung her legs out of bed. She took 3 steps toward the vanity and stopped abruptly. Behind her, Elise tripped on the edge of the antique rug, stumbling forward with a gasp. Her hand flailed out, striking the heavy porcelain Ming vase on the side table. In cycle 1 through 10, the vase had shattered, sending Elise into a crying fit about bad omens that lasted 20 minutes. In cycle 11, Maren had tried to catch her mother, and they had both fallen. Today, Maren simply reached out her left hand without looking, catching the vase by its neck a fraction of an inch before it hit the floor. She set it back down with a soft click and turned to face her stunned mother. The silence that followed was heavy, but Maren didn't care to fill it. She moved through the morning like a soldier dismantling a bomb, every motion efficient and hollow. The stylists arrived and fussed over her hair, spraying clouds of fixative that smelled like chemicals and artificial flowers. Then came the dress. It was a masterpiece of white silk and lace, a garment that cost more than most families in the pack earned in a decade. In cycle 15, Maren had burned it in the fireplace. In cycle 32, she had stained it with red wine just to see if it would stop the wedding. It never did. Today, she stepped into it as if she were putting on a shroud. The drive to the chapel was a blur of gray skies and wet pavement. Rain lashed against the tinted windows of the limousine, blurring the world outside into streaks of charcoal and slate. Elise chattered nervously about how rain on a wedding day signified fertility and luck, oblivious to the fact that the storm was actually a manifestation of localized magical instability caused by the Alpha's volatile aura. Maren watched the droplets race down the glass, counting the seconds. 3 miles out, the driver slammed on the brakes to avoid a deer darting across the road, just as he always did. Marin didn't even blink. She just adjusted her veil, her heart rate steady and slow, waiting for the end. When the heavy oak doors of the Gilded Ridge Chapel creaked open, the scent hit her like a physical blow. It was an overwhelming, suffocating wave of lilies. To anyone else, it smelled like a celebration. To Marin, it smelled like a funeral. The organ music swelled, shaking the floorboards beneath her satin heels. She began the long walk down the aisle, ignoring the hundreds of faces turned toward her. She knew which of them were cheating on their spouses, which were embezzling PAC funds, and which would be the first to die when the blast wave hit. She focused only on the altar. Alpha Alden Sterling stood there, the epitome of the golden boy. His suit was tailored to perfection, his hair gleaming under the chandeliers, and his smile practiced and hollow. He watched her approach with eyes that held no affection, only a cold, calculating assessment. He believed he was making a noble sacrifice for his pack by rejecting a mate who couldn't shift, unaware that his arrogance was the trigger for the apocalypse. Marin reached the altar and took her place beside him, folding her hands demurely. The music cut out, leaving a sharp, ringing silence in its wake. Alden stepped forward, projecting his voice to the back of the room. He spoke of unity and strength, his charisma washing over the crowd. Then his tone dropped, becoming icy and serious. He turned to Marin, his lip curling slightly. This was it. The moment the loop closed. Marin braced herself for the rejection, for the crack of thunder, for the searing heat that would melt the stained glass and strip the flesh from her bones. She closed her eyes, welcoming the darkness. Alden opened his mouth to deliver the final blow, but the words never came. Instead, a deafening crash shattered the sanctity of the moment. The massive double doors at the back of the church didn't just open. They exploded inward, splintering into jagged shards of wood and iron that rained down on the screaming guests. Through the dust and debris, a dark silhouette stepped into the sanctuary, radiating a power so terrifying that the shadows in the room seemed to bend toward him. It wasn't the apocalypse Marin had expected. It was something far more dangerous. Chapter 2. The Witness Claim. The dust from the shattered doors billowed into the sanctuary like a physical phantom, coating the pristine white lilies in a layer of gray grit. For a moment, the only sound in the opulent space was the settling of debris and the shocked, collective intake of breath from 300 guests. Marin did not flinch. She had seen this room incinerated by magical fire, crushed by earthquakes, and dissolved into nothingness. A little structural damage was hardly impressive. However, the figure striding through the ruined entrance was an anomaly she had never calculated. He was a mountain of a man, dressed not in formal wear, but in dark, utilitarian tactical gear that looked stained with engine grease and old blood. Alpha Gant of the Black Root Pack was a terrifying legend, a scarred warlord known for his brutality and his pack's industrial grit. He walked down the center aisle with a predatory grace that made the Gilded Ridge guards hesitate, their hands hovering over their weapons but too paralyzed by his sheer audacity to draw them. A jagged scar ran from his jawline down to his collarbone, a stark white line against his tanned skin that seemed to pulse with its own violent history. He didn't look at the trembling guests or the armed guards. His gaze was locked entirely on the altar, fixed with a singular, burning intensity that made Marin's breath hitch in her throat. Alden recovered from his shock, his face flushing a deep, furious crimson. He stepped down from the dais, his hands balling into fists as his golden aura began to flare, heating the air in the room until it shimmered. He barked a command for his guards to seize the intruder, but Gant didn't even slow down. He simply raised his voice, a deep baritone that carried effortlessly over the murmuring crowd, and spoke words that sounded like they were dredged up from the bedrock of their history. He invoked the witness claim, a law so ancient that most modern wolves had forgotten it existed, a statute that allowed a rival alpha to seize a witness to a crime committed on sacred ground. The room fell into a stunned silence. Alden froze, his momentum arrested by the weight of the archaic law. The rejection of a mate, even a wolfless one without cause, was technically a crime against the balance of magic, though no one ever enforced it. By declaring Maren a witness to her own baseless rejection, Gant had created a legal shield that not even Alden could break without triggering immediate, catastrophic pack war. Gant reached the altar, ignoring the fuming Alpha entirely, and extended a hand toward Maren. It was a rough, calloused hand, the hand of a man who built things and broke them, so unlike the manicured softness of the Gilded Ridge elite. Maren stared at the hand. This was the deviation. This was the variable that hadn't existed in the previous 99 loops. In every other lifetime, she was alone in this moment. Taking his hand meant leaving the script she had memorized. It meant stepping off the edge of the map into territory she couldn't predict. But looking into Gant's dark eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in a century. Recognition. He wasn't looking at a victim. He was looking at a partner. Without letting herself think, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid, anchoring her to a reality that suddenly felt terrifyingly fragile. Gant pulled her from the altar, not roughly, but with an urgency that brokered no argument. He turned his back on Alden, a supreme insult, and began to drag her back down the aisle, past the rows of gaping guests and the shattered remains of the doors. Alden screamed her name, a sound of possessive rage that vibrated in the floorboards, but Gant didn't stop. They stepped out into the pouring rain, leaving the suffocating scent of lilies behind for the smell of wet asphalt and impending violence. A massive, matte black tactical truck idled at the curb, its engine rumbling like a chained beast. Gant opened the passenger door and hoisted her inside, the heavy silk of her dress bunching around her legs. As he slammed the door shut, severing her from the life she had died in 99 times, Maren realized with a jolt of adrenaline that for the first time in 100 years, she had absolutely no idea what was going to happen next. Chapter 3. 3 miles out. The interior of the truck was a stark contrast to the limousine's plush leather and champagne flutes. It was a mobile command center, filled with the hum of encrypted radios and the glow of tactical displays. The seats were reinforced, the windows were bulletproof glass thick enough to stop a high-caliber round, and the air smelled of stale coffee and gun oil. Gant threw the vehicle into gear, the tires spinning on the wet pavement before finding traction and launching them forward with enough force to press Maren back against the seat. They tore away from the chapel, the speedometer climbing rapidly as they merged onto the main road leading out of the Gilded Ridge territory. Maren sat frozen, her hands gripping the edges of her ruined wedding dress. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by the cold, hard logic that had kept her sane through decades of trauma. She watched the familiar landmarks blur past the window, the bakery she used to visit in Cycle 20, the park where she had tried to hide in Cycle 65. They were moving fast, too fast for the slick conditions. Her internal clock, calibrated by death, began to tick down. She knew every curve of this road. She knew every pothole. And she knew that in exactly 2 minutes and 14 seconds, a stag would bolt from the tree line 3 miles past the city limits. In Cycle 12, the collision had flipped their car, killing her instantly. In Cycle 50, the driver had swerved into a ravine. It was a fixed point in the chaos, a death trap that the universe seemed determined to keep in place. Maren glanced at Gant. His profile was grim, his jaw set hard as he navigated the winding road. He drove with a terrifying precision, his large hands steady on the wheel. He couldn't possibly know. To him, this was just a daring escape. He was driving blind into a future she had already suffered. She had to speak. She had to warn him, even if it sounded insane. She cleared her throat, her voice rasping from disuse. She started to say that there was a deer, that he needed to slow down, that death was waiting around the next blind curve. But the words barely left her lips before Gant reacted. They were still a quarter-mile from the impact zone when he abruptly downshifted, the engine roaring in protest. He didn't just slow down. He cut the wheel hard to the left, crossing the double yellow line and taking the inside lane, completely bypassing the blind spot where the animal always appeared. Seconds later, a massive stag burst from the brush, hooves skidding on the wet asphalt, exactly where the truck would have been if Gant had stayed in his lane. The animal scrambled for footing and disappeared into the woods on the other side, unharmed. Maren stared at the empty road behind them, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He hadn't just reacted. He had anticipated. He had preempted the accident with the casual ease of someone who had driven this exact stretch of road a dozen times before. The impossibility of it made the world tilt on its axis. Gant straightened the wheel, accelerating again as the danger passed. The silence in the cab was sudden and deafening. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes on the gray horizon, but the tension in his shoulders suggested he knew exactly what she was thinking. Maren turned to him, her voice barely a whisper, asking how he could possibly have known to swerve. Gant tightened his grip on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He finally glanced at her, his dark eyes holding a depth of exhaustion and sorrow that mirrored her own. He told her simply that he remembered because he had been there in Cycle 12, and he remembered the sound of the metal crushing against the bone. The confession hung in the air between them, heavier than the humidity of the storm. Maren felt the blood drain from her face. She wasn't alone. For 99 lifetimes, she had been the solitary observer of the apocalypse, the only wretched soul cursed to remember the fire. But he was there. He was in the dark with her. Gant reached across the console, his hand hovering for a moment before resting gently on her arm, a silent offering of solidarity. He told her they had a lot to discuss, but first, they had to survive the next 10 minutes. Chapter 4. The Void Wolf. The rearview mirror was suddenly awash in blinding white light. Alden hadn't waited for the legalities of the witness claim to settle. He had sent his elite guard, the Goldcrests, to retrieve his property. 3 low-slung interceptor vehicles roared up behind them, their engines screaming as they closed the gap. Maren recognized the formation instantly. It was a pincer maneuver, designed to force a target off the road and into the ditch. In Cycle 77, this exact squad had run her down before she even made it to the highway. She instinctively braced herself for the impact, her muscles locking up in anticipation of the crash. Gant didn't panic. He checked the mirrors with a calm detachment that was more terrifying than any display of rage. He muttered a curse under his breath and told Maren to keep her head down. Then he slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt in the middle of the desolate highway, the tires smoking against the wet pavement. The maneuver caught the pursuers off guard. The lead interceptor swerved wildly to avoid a collision, spinning out and blocking the road for the 2 cars behind it. It was a calculated bottleneck. Gant unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the driving rain as if he were stepping out for a casual stroll. Maren watched through the bulletproof glass, her breath fogging the window. The Goldcrest guards spilled out of their vehicles, shifting mid-stride. Their bodies contorted and cracked, bones reshaping until 3 massive wolves stood on the tarmac. Their fur was a mix of gold and tawny brown, bristling with aggression. They snarled, their fangs bared, ready to tear the intruder apart. Against 3 elite shifters, a single alpha, even one as strong as Gant, should have been overwhelmed. But Gant didn't shift into a wolf. He didn't grow fur or claws. He simply let go of the human shape he was wearing. The air around him seemed to warp and collapse. The light from the interceptor headlights didn't reflect off him. It fell into him. He became a silhouette, a 3-dimensional shadow cut from the fabric of the night. This was the Void Wolf, a genetic anomaly Maren had only heard rumors of in the deepest archives of the Pack libraries. He was an absence of reality, a tear in the world. He moved without sound, a fluid darkness that flowed over the pavement. The Goldcrest wolves hesitated, their instincts screaming that this was not prey, nor predator, but something entirely unnatural. The fight, if it could be called that, was silent and brief. The void surged forward, enveloping the first wolf. There was no yelp, no crunch of bone, just a sudden stillness as the guard was rendered unconscious by the sheer sensory deprivation of Gant's form. The other two wolves lunged, but they were fighting a phantom. Gant moved through them, his shadowy tendrils striking with the force of a wrecking ball. He tossed them aside with contemptuous ease, leaving them broken and whimpering on the asphalt. It wasn't a battle, it was a dismissal. He wasn't killing them, he was ensuring they couldn't follow. The darkness coalesced back into the shape of a man. Gant stood there for a moment, the rain passing through the fading edges of his shadow form before he fully solidified. He adjusted his collar, rolled his shoulders, and walked back to the truck. When he opened the door, Maren pressed herself back against the seat, her eyes wide. She had known he was dangerous, the butcher of Blackroot, but she had never understood what that truly meant until now. He looked at her, seeing the fear, and his expression softened imperceptibly. He apologized for the delay and put the truck back in gear. They crossed the heavy iron bridge that marked the border of the Blackroot territory 10 minutes later. The landscape shifted dramatically. The manicured forests and golden fields of Gilded Ridge gave way to jagged cliffs, dense pine thickets, and the skeletal silhouettes of mining rigs. The air here tasted of coal dust and ozone, sharp and industrial. It was an ugly, brutal place compared to the paradise she had left, but as they passed the fortified checkpoints, Maren felt a strange sensation in her chest. For the first time in 100 years, the crushing weight of inevitable death felt slightly lighter. They were in the wolf's den now, and the monster at the door was on her side. Chapter 5. Cycle 45. The Blackroot stronghold was carved directly into the side of a granite mountain, a fortress of concrete and steel that looked more like a bunker than a pack house. Gant drove the truck into a subterranean garage, the heavy blast doors grinding shut behind them with a sound of finality. As the engine died, the silence rushed back in, intimate and heavy. Maren sat still, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the crushing exhaustion of a century of trauma. Gant didn't rush her. He got out, walked around to her side and opened the door, offering his hand again. This time, she took it without hesitation. He led her through a maze of corridors, past pack members who stopped and stared, their expressions a mix of awe and confusion at seeing their alpha with a bride in a ruined wedding dress. They arrived at a private wing of the stronghold, a space that felt lived in and surprisingly warm. Books lined the walls, and a fire crackled in a rough-hewn stone hearth. Gant pointed her toward a leather armchair and went to a cabinet, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers, and the spark of contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with magic. Maren took a sip, the whiskey burning a path down her throat, grounding her. She looked at him, really looked at him, and asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the deer crossing. She needed to understand how he remembered. The loops were supposed to be her burden alone. Gant sat opposite her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He explained that his void nature anchored him outside the normal flow of time. When the world reset, his consciousness didn't wash away like the others. He described it as standing in a river while everyone else was swept downstream. The water rushed past him, but he remained fixed. He watched her carefully, gauging her reaction, before dropping the next bombshell. He told her that he hadn't just started remembering today. He had been watching her, learning the pattern, and calculating the extraction for 55 loops. He spoke of Cycle 45 with a quiet reverence that made Maren's heart ache. In that timeline, she had fled into the mountains, and he had found her. They had spent 3 weeks together in a hunting cabin before the volatility of Alden's magic caught up with them. Maren had no memory of it. That version of her had been wiped clean. But the way Gant looked at her told the whole story. He told her she had loved him then. He said it without arrogance, just a simple statement of fact. He described the way she laughed when she was safe, the way she took her coffee, the way she slept. Listening to him was like hearing a ghost story about herself. Tears pricked her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she had been loved, truly loved, in a life she couldn't recall. Gant leaned back, his expression hardening again. He told her that in Cycle 45 he had promised to save her, and he had failed. He had spent every lifetime since then perfecting the plan to ensure he wouldn't fail again. But there was a complication. Gant gestured to a bank of monitors on the far wall, displaying news feeds from Gilded Ridge. Alden wasn't just angry, he was accelerating the timeline. Reports were coming in that the Ascension ceremony, usually scheduled for a month after the wedding, was being moved up. Alden was claiming that the theft of his mate required him to seize absolute power immediately to protect the pack. Maren felt the blood drain from her face. Usually they had weeks before the world ended. Now, Gant explained grimly, looking at the scrolling text, they had less than 3 days before Alden tore the sky open. The loop hadn't just been disrupted, the bomb timer had been cut in half. Chapter 6. The Ascendant Threat. The news feeds projected onto the monitors in Gant's office were a chaotic mosaic of panic and propaganda. Every major network in the region was broadcasting Alpha Alden's face, his features twisted into a mask of righteous indignation that Maren knew was entirely manufactured. He stood before a podium emblazoned with the Gilded Ridge crest, his voice booming through the speakers with a fervor that bordered on hysteria. He wasn't just declaring war on Blackroot. He was declaring a crusade against chaos itself, framing Maren's abduction as an existential threat to the stability of the magical ley lines. Maren watched the performance with a cold, detached fascination. She had seen him play this role in dozens of lifetimes, usually right before he unleashed a shockwave that leveled cities, but there was a frantic energy in his eyes today that was new. The deviation in the timeline hadn't just changed her path, it had unmoored him completely. Gant stood behind her, his large hands gripping the back of the leather chair, his presence a solid wall of heat against her spine. He remained silent as Alden announced the acceleration of the Ascension ceremony. The ritual, designed to elevate an alpha to a prime, required immense stability and focus, 2 things Alden currently lacked. By moving the date up to the coming full moon, only 3 days away, he was essentially trying to hotwire a nuclear reactor with a screwdriver. Maren felt a familiar numbness creeping into her extremities. In previous loops, the apocalypse was a slow burn, a gradual decay of reality that gave her weeks to dread the end. This time the fuse was short, sparking, and rapidly disappearing into the powder keg. She turned away from the screen, her mind racing through the implications. If Alden attempted the ascension in his current state, without a mate to ground his metaphysical mass, he wouldn't just crack the tectonic plates, he would shatter the boundaries of the dimension. The void that Gant controlled would become the only thing left, a consuming nothingness that would swallow history. She looked up at Gant, seeing the grim calculation in his dark eyes. He knew it too. The rescue mission had been successful, but the survival parameters had shifted. They couldn't just hide in the mountains and wait for the heat to die down. There was no waiting this out. Maren stood up, the silk of her ruined dress rustling softly in the quiet room. She walked to the window, looking out at the industrial sprawl of the Blackroot territory, the smokestacks rising like iron trees against the stormy sky. She realized with a sudden crystal clarity that running was no longer an option. For 99 lives, she had been the victim, the refugee, the collateral damage. She had spent a century trying to survive the end of the world, never realizing that the only way to survive it was to prevent it. She turned back to Gant, her expression hardening into something sharp and dangerous. She told him they had to kill him. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a tactical necessity. Gant didn't blink. He didn't offer platitudes about finding another way or seeking a diplomatic solution. He simply nodded, accepting the violence of the request as if she had asked for a glass of water. He moved to a heavy steel locker in the corner of the room, unlocking it with a thumbprint scan, and began pulling out maps, blueprints, and dossiers. He laid them out on the large oak table, covering the wood with the geography of their enemy. Maren walked over, her eyes scanning the familiar layouts of the Gilded Ridge stronghold. She knew these hallways better than the veins in her own hands. She reached out, placing a finger on the ventilation shaft of the eastern wing. It was time to stop being the bride and start being the assassin. Chapter 7. The War Room. The conference room was filled with the scent of stale coffee and aggressive skepticism. Gant's lieutenants, a group of hardened warriors who looked like they had been carved from the same granite as their mountain home, stared at Maren with open distrust. To them, she was a liability, a fragile human female in a torn wedding dress who had brought the wrath of the Golden Alpha to their doorstep. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances that ranged from pity to annoyance, waiting for Gant to dismiss her so the real planning could begin. Maren stood at the head of the table, her hands resting flat on the cool metal surface, feeling the vibration of the ventilation systems beneath her palms. She let the silence stretch, letting their doubt marinate until it became palpable. One of the lieutenants, a scarred female wolf named Kyle with a jagged ear and a permanent scowl, finally broke the silence. She demanded to know why they were wasting time with a civilian when they should be fortifying the perimeter. Kyle argued that Maren couldn't possibly understand the complexities of pack security or magical wards. Maren didn't flinch. She simply turned her gaze to Kyle, her eyes flat and devoid of fear. In Cycle 33, Kyle had led the assault team that accidentally killed Maren during a botched rescue attempt. In Cycle 60, Maren had watched Kale die screaming as the Gilded Ridge sorcerers boiled the blood in her veins. Maren knew Kale better than Kale knew herself. Maren spoke softly, her voice cutting through the grumbling like a razor wire. She recited the access code to the Gilded Ridge Armory, a sequence of numbers that changed every 6 hours, but followed a mathematical algorithm she had cracked decades ago. She described the exact rotation of the perimeter guards, down to the 3-minute window during the shift change at the northern gate where the sensors were blind. She detailed the location of the backup generator's cooling intake, a structural weakness that wasn't on any blueprint, but had caused a catastrophic failure in Cycle 18. The room went deathly quiet. The skepticism on the lieutenants' faces morphed into stunned confusion, then grudging respect. She picked up a marker and began to draw on the whiteboard behind her, her movements precise and confident. She sketched the layout of Alden's private sanctum, marking the hidden pressure plates and the magical tripwires that were invisible to the naked eye. She explained that Alden's paranoia had led him to install a secondary dampening field that blocked teleportation, meaning any direct assault would be suicide. She outlined a route through the old sewers, a path that had been sealed off since the Great War, but was still accessible if you knew which brick to press. As she spoke, she saw the shift in Gant's eyes. He wasn't looking at her with the protective worry of a lover. He was looking at her with the strategic appreciation of a general. When she finished, she capped the marker and turned back to the room. The silence was no longer heavy with doubt. It was heavy with anticipation. Kale leaned forward, her scowl replaced by a look of intense focus, and asked Maren how she could possibly know all of this. Maren looked at the map, a complex web of 99 failures, and simply said that she paid attention. Gant stood up then, his massive frame dominating the room, and endorsed her plan with a single nod. He told his pack that from this moment on, Maren's word was law. She wasn't just a guest under protection. She was the architect of their survival. For the first time, Maren felt a flicker of power that had nothing to do with magic. She wasn't just the girl who died. She was the woman who knew how to kill the king. Chapter 8. Muscle Memory. The training dojo in the lower levels of the Blackroot compound was a cavernous space of concrete and impact mats, smelling of sweat and iron. Gant had insisted on a quick assessment of her physical capabilities, not because he doubted her spirit, but because he needed to know if her body could keep up with her mind. Maren stood in the center of the mat, wearing borrowed tactical gear that was slightly too large for her slender frame. She felt strange, almost alien, in clothes that weren't a wedding dress or a hospital gown. Gant circled her, his movements fluid and predatory, testing her reflexes with light, probing strikes. He threw a jab at her left shoulder. Maren didn't think. She reacted. Her body, though technically untrained in this timeline, carried the phantom muscle memory of a dozen lifetimes where she had learned to fight. She sidestepped, parrying the blow with her forearm and pivoting to deliver a counterstrike to his ribs. It wasn't strong enough to hurt an alpha, but the technique was flawless. Gant caught her fist in his palm, his eyes widening in surprise. He froze, holding her hand against his chest, the impact resonating between them. In that moment, the dojo faded away, and for a split second, Maren felt the echo of a cabin in the woods, of rain on a tin roof, of this same man teaching her how to throw a punch in a life she didn't remember. Gant didn't let go of her hand. He pulled her slightly closer, the air between them charging with a static electricity that made the hair on Maren's arms stand up. He murmured that she fought like she had been trained by a Blackroot soldier. Maren looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. She realized then that she had been. In Cycle 45, he must have taught her this. Every instinctive block, every shift of her weight, was a legacy of the love they had shared in the lost timeline. It was a terrifying intimacy, to know that her body remembered him, even when her mind did not. He released her hand slowly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, and stepped back to give her space. The intensity in the room shifted from combat to something far more dangerous. Maren asked him about the scar on his neck again, the one he had mentioned earlier. Now, in the harsh light of the gym, she could see the jagged edges of the tissue, the way it marred the smooth expanse of his skin. Gant touched the mark absent-mindedly, his expression darkening. He told her that in Cycle 70, she had been cornered by a feral vampire that Alden had hired as a mercenary. Gant had taken the bite meant for her throat. Maren stared at the scar, a physical record of a sacrifice she had never witnessed. It was overwhelming to realize that while she reset, wiping the slate clean of her physical wounds, Gant carried the accumulation of every failure on his skin. He was a living map of her deaths. She stepped forward, driven by an impulse she couldn't control, and reached out to touch the scar. Her fingers grazed the rough skin, and Gant shuddered, a low sound rumbling in his chest that was half growl, half sigh. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing, and for a moment, they weren't a strategist and a warlord plotting an assassination. They were two exhausted souls finding the only safe harbor in a world determined to drown them. But the moment was shattered by the harsh beep of the intercom. The team was ready. The first mission was a go. Chapter 9. The First Infiltration. The target was a remote substation on the outskirts of Gilded Ridge territory, a brutalist concrete block surrounded by an electrified fence and hidden beneath a canopy of magically woven camouflage. Inside lay the kinetic dampener, a piece of arcane technology they needed to neutralize Alden's personal shields. Without it, any bullet or blade aimed at the Alpha would simply disintegrate. Maren crouched in the underbrush 100 yards out, viewing the facility through the scope of a high-powered rifle. She wasn't the shooter, that was Kale, but she was the eyes. Gant was down there in the shadows, a smudge of darkness moving against the perimeter wall. Maren adjusted her headset, her voice calm and steady as she guided him. She instructed him to hold position, counting down the seconds until the automated searchlights began their reset cycle. 3, 2, 1. The lights flickered and swept left, leaving a narrow corridor of darkness. Gant moved instantly, scaling the 12-foot fence with supernatural speed and dropping silently onto the other side. Maren felt a surge of adrenaline that was sharper and more addictive than fear. For the first time, she wasn't helplessly watching events unfold. She was orchestrating them. She was the conductor of the symphony. She guided him through the outer yard, warning him of the pressure sensors buried in the gravel path. Gant moved with a trust that was terrifying, placing his feet exactly where she told him, never hesitating to question her judgment. He reached the heavy steel door of the maintenance entrance. Maren closed her eyes, visualizing the keypad she had seen a technician use in Cycle 82. She recited the code into the comms, praying that Alden hadn't updated the security protocols in the last week. There was a pause, a series of beeps, and then the satisfying click of a magnetic lock disengaging. Gant slipped inside. The interior was a maze of humming turbines and crackling energy conduits. Maren switched to the schematics on her tablet, guiding Gant toward the containment unit. He encountered 2 guards in the central corridor. Maren watched on the hacked security feed as Gant shifted into his void form. He didn't just fight them, he engulfed them. The darkness swallowed the light in the hallway, and when it receded, the guards were unconscious on the floor, unharmed but incapacitated. It was efficient, brutal, and silent. He retrieved the dampener, a glowing blue cylinder the size of a football, and secured it in his pack. The extraction was supposed to be the easy part, but as Gant moved back toward the exit, the ground beneath the facility gave a violent lurch. It wasn't an earthquake. Maren saw it through the scope. The trees around the perimeter didn't shake. They glitched. For a split second, the oak tree to her left was a pine tree, then a pile of lumber, then an oak tree again. The reality of the world flickered like a corrupt video file. Panic surged in her chest. This wasn't Alden's magic. This was something else, something deeper. She screamed into the comms for Gant to run. He burst through the door just as the searchlights exploded, not from impact, but because the glass bulbs suddenly turned into water. They sprinted for the extraction point, the world around them convulsing as if the timeline itself was having a seizure. Chapter 10. Glitch in the Matrix. They made it back to the truck, lungs burning and hearts hammering, the stolen dampener secure in the back. But the atmosphere in the cab was thick with a new kind of terror. Gant drove with white-knuckled intensity, speeding away from the zone where reality had briefly dissolved. Maren stared out the window, watching the landscape roll by. It looked normal now. Trees were trees, rocks were rocks, but the image of the searchlights turning into water was burned into her retinas. That wasn't a standard magical anomaly. That was a breakdown of the source code. Gant broke the silence first, his voice low and rough. He asked what the hell had happened back there. He had felt it too, a sensation like the gravity had turned off for a second, like his body was trying to be in 2 places at once. Maren didn't answer immediately. She was piecing together a puzzle that had been scattered across 100 lifetimes. She thought about the way the loops always reset exactly when she died. She thought about how the world didn't just end. It rewound. She thought about the deer she saved, the vase she caught, the script she changed. She looked at her hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from a sudden, horrifying surplus of energy coursing through her veins. It felt like static, like the hum of a high-voltage line. Maren realized with a sickening lurch that the energy wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from her. Alden had rejected her for being wolfless, for having no magic. But what if he was wrong? What if she didn't lack magic? What if she was so full of it that she was subconsciously rewriting the universe to keep herself alive? She turned to Gant, her eyes wide and terrified. She told him the truth that was finally clicking into place. The loop wasn't Alden's doing. It wasn't a punishment from the fates, or a side effect of the ascension. It was her. She was the anchor. Her survival instinct was so powerful, so catastrophic, that every time she died, her dormant magic screamed no and dragged the entire timeline back to the starting line. The glitches were happening because she was alive past her expiration date. She was a paradox. By surviving the wedding, she was forcing the universe to render new territory, and the engine was overheating. Gant stared at her, the truck drifting slightly over the center line before he corrected it. The implication hung between them, massive and terrible. If Marin was the source of the loops, then killing Alden might not stop the resets. Worse, if her magic was reacting to her stress, her fear, her desire to live, then the only way to truly stabilize the world might be the one thing she had spent 100 lifetimes trying to avoid. To fix the timeline, she might have to stop fighting. She might have to let herself die, and this time, stay dead. The truck sped on through the dark, carrying the savior of the world, who was also its destroyer. Chapter 11. The Butcher's Scars. The safe house was a converted ranger station deep within the Ironbark Woods, a structure that smelled of old cedar and damp earth rather than the sterile metallic tang of the main stronghold. Outside, the unnatural storm continued to rage, the wind howling like a wounded animal as the timeline struggled to stabilize itself. Inside, the only light came from a flickering halogen lantern that cast long, dancing shadows against the log walls. Marin sat on the edge of a cot, a first aid kit open beside her, while Gant sat on a wooden chair, his tactical shirt stripped off to the waist. The skirmish at the substation had been cleaner than most, but the kinetic dampener had leaked raw magical radiation, leaving burns across his ribs that needed to be treated with a salve made of crushed herbs and silver dust. As Marin applied the paste, her fingers brushing against his warm, hard skin, she found herself tracing the landscape of his torso. It was a map of violence. The vampire bite on his neck was just the beginning. There was a jagged burn mark on his left pectoral muscle, a puncture wound near his kidney that looked like it had been made by a spear, and a series of thin white slices across his forearms that suggested defensive knife wounds. In her memories, Gant was a distant, terrifying figure who ruled the rival pack with an iron fist. But here, under the harsh light of the lantern, he was a mosaic of survival. Every scar told a story, but Marin realized with a sickening jolt that she didn't know the plot. She asked him quietly about the burn on his chest. Gant flinched slightly, not from the pain of the salve, but from the memory. He kept his eyes fixed on the darkness outside the window as he spoke. He told her it was from Cycle 52. In that timeline, Alden had set the Gilded Ridge forests on fire to flush them out. Gant had run back into the inferno to retrieve Marin after she twisted her ankle. He had shielded her body with his own as a burning pine collapsed on top of them. He had held the weight of the flaming tree for 4 minutes until the rescue team arrived. Marin stared at the scar, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had no memory of the fire. She had no memory of the pain. She had only woken up the next morning at 8 a.m., spotless and whole, while he carried the brand of her salvation on his skin forever. It was a profound imbalance that made her chest ache. She was the pristine doll, constantly reset to factory settings, while he was the vessel that accumulated the damage. She whispered that it wasn't fair, that he shouldn't have to carry the physical toll of her survival. Gant turned to look at her then, his expression fierce and unguarded. He reached out, his rough hand cupping her cheek, and told her that the scars were the only things he had to prove that she was real. In the void between loops, when the world dissolved into gray static, the pain was the anchor that reminded him she existed. It was a declaration of love so raw and terrifying that Marin felt tears prick her eyes. She leaned into his touch, realizing that while she was the cause of the loop, he was the reason she wanted to break it. Chapter 12. Intercepted. They left the ranger station at dawn, the sky a bruised purple color that indicated high levels of magical toxicity in the atmosphere. The plan was to move the kinetic dampener to a secondary location where they could weaponize it, but they barely made it 5 miles down the logging road before the ambush struck. There was no warning this time, no deer, no glitching trees. One moment, the road was empty. The next, a lance of pure golden energy slammed into the hood of the truck, flipping the multi-ton vehicle into the air like a child's toy. The world spun in a chaotic blur of metal and glass before the truck crashed down onto its side, sliding 30 yards through the mud and debris. Marin hung suspended in her seatbelt, the breath knocked out of her lungs. Beside her, Gant was already moving, cutting himself free and kicking out the shattered windshield. He hauled Marin out of the wreckage just as a second energy lance incinerated the fuel tank. The explosion threw them into the ditch, the heat searing the backs of their necks. Marin scrambled to her feet, coughing in the acrid smoke, and saw them. A squad of Alden's elite sorcerers, dressed in white robes embroidered with gold thread, stood on the ridge above them. They weren't shifters. They were battle mages, mercenaries paid to burn things down from a distance. And in the center of their formation, holding a glowing crystal, was a tracker. Marin realized with horror how they had been found. It wasn't a bug in the truck or a traitor in the pack. It was her. The temporal energy radiating off her, the glitch she had discovered in the truck, acted like a beacon to anyone with the right frequency. She was a walking lighthouse. The mages began to chant, a collective spell forming a massive ball of fire above their heads. Gant roared, shifting into his void form, expanding his shadow to create a shield over Marin. But even the void couldn't absorb that much focused thermal energy forever. They were pinned down, outgunned, and seconds away from incineration. Marin's eyes darted to the wreckage of the truck. The kinetic dampener was still in the back, inside a reinforced case that had spilled onto the road. It was designed to neutralize shields, but she knew the schematics. If she overloaded the core, it could create an electromagnetic pulse that would disrupt active magic. It was a theory she had only tested in simulations in Cycle 88, and it had a 40% chance of killing them both. But looking at the fire swirling above, 40% looked like salvation. She broke cover, sprinting toward the burning truck. Gant screamed her name, a sound of pure terror, but she didn't stop. She dove for the case, punched in the override code, and twisted the core release. The dampener screamed, a high-pitched mechanical whine, and then detonated. It wasn't an explosion of fire, but of silence. A wave of blue distortion rippled outward, passing through Marin, Gant, and the mages on the ridge. The fireball above the mages vanished instantly. Their glowing staffs went dark. The magical tethers holding their robes together unraveled. For a moment, the world was stripped of all magic. Marin fell to her knees, the feedback ringing in her ears, as the mages panicked, suddenly powerless against a furious alpha who was already charging up the hill with a knife in his hand. The playing field had been leveled, and Gant was not a man who missed an opportunity. Chapter 13. A quiet place. The storm outside had intensified, turning the forest into a cacophony of thunder and lashing rain. But inside the cave, the silence was absolute. They had abandoned the wreckage of the truck and hiked 3 miles into the limestone caverns that honeycombed the Blackroot Mountains. It was a tight, enclosed space, barely large enough for 2 people, but it was dry and defensible. Marin sat against the cold stone wall, shivering violently as the adrenaline crash hit her system. Her dress was ruined beyond recognition, the white silk torn and stained with mud and grease. But she didn't care. She was alive. They were alive. Gant built a small, smokeless fire near the cave mouth, his movements jerky and agitated. The dampener pulse had disrupted his ability to shift, locking him in his human form for the next few hours. He was vulnerable, and he hated it. He finished with the fire and turned to Marin, his eyes blazing with a mixture of relief and fury. He demanded to know what she had been thinking, running into the line of fire like that. He paced the small space, his voice echoing off the walls, berating her for taking a risk that could have reset the loop. But Maren heard the tremor in his voice. It wasn't anger. It was the terrifying realization that he had almost lost her again. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and crossed the small distance between them. She didn't argue or defend her strategy. She simply reached out and took his face in her hands. The contact stopped his pacing instantly. He looked down at her, his chest heaving, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face and the exhaustion etched around his eyes. Maren whispered that she was done being the one who was saved. In this loop, they were partners. If they went down together. The declaration hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Gant made a low sound in his throat and surged forward, crushing her mouth to his. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision of desperation and a century of suppressed longing. It tasted of rain and copper, and the fierce, unyielding will to survive. Maren's hands tangled in his dark hair, pulling him closer, needing to feel the solid reality of him against her. For 99 lifetimes, she had been cold, detached, a ghost watching her own tragedy. Now, she was burning. Gant lifted her effortlessly, pressing her back against the cave wall, his body shielding her from the cold, from the storm, from the inevitable end of the world. In the darkness of the cave, with the apocalypse waiting outside, they found a fragile, desperate peace in each other's arms. Chapter 14. The Golden Tyrant. Maren woke to the sound of static. Gant was crouched by the cave entrance, fiddling with a portable comms unit he had salvaged from one of the dead mages. The device crackled, spitting out bursts of white noise before locking onto a frequency. It was a direct broadcast from the Gilded Ridge Palace. Maren crawled over, wrapping a thermal blanket around her shoulders, and peered at the small, cracked screen. What she saw made her blood run cold. Alpha Alden was seated on his throne, but he looked less like a king and more like a corpse being animated by electricity. His skin was translucent, revealing a network of veins that pulsed with a sickly, glowing gold light. His eyes were entirely black, the whites consumed by the overwhelming magical pressure building inside his skull. He was consuming raw mana crystals, crushing them in his hands and inhaling the dust. A dangerous, addictive practice meant to artificially boost an alpha's power levels. He was deteriorating rapidly, his physical form unable to contain the energies he was hoarding for the ascension. He looked into the camera, his gaze manic and unfocused, and addressed the region. He didn't scream or shout. He spoke with a terrifyingly calm, slurry cadence. He announced that since the Blackroot Pack refused to return his property, he would have to cleanse their territory. He held up a map of the Ironbark Woods, the very forest where Maren and Gant were currently hiding. With a casual wave of his hand, he traced a line of fire across the paper. He declared that at sundown, his mages would initiate the Scorched Earth Protocol. They would ignite the magical ley lines beneath the forest, turning the entire mountain range into a volcanic wasteland. It wasn't war, it was extermination. Gant slammed his fist into the stone wall, cracking the rock. The Blackroot territory was home to thousands of families, innocent civilians who worked the mines and the mills. Alden was willing to burn them all alive just to flush out one woman. Maren stared at the screen, watching Alden's twitching smile. She realized that he was no longer operating on any logic she could predict. In previous loops, he was arrogant and cruel, but he was sane. This instability, this madness, was a direct result of her survival. The universe was breaking him because it couldn't break her. The broadcast ended, leaving the cave in silence. Gant stood up, grabbing his gear. His face was a mask of cold, deadly resolve. He stated that they had to move. He would take the truck, drive straight to the palace gates, and challenge Alden to single combat. It was suicide. Alden was currently a walking nuclear reactor. He would vaporize Gant before he got within striking distance. But Gant wouldn't listen. He couldn't let his pack burn. He was an alpha first and a lover second. He checked his weapon, his back to her, preparing to die for his people. Marin knew she had to stop him, not with force, but with the one weapon he couldn't counter, the truth of the future. Chapter 15. The Ultimatum. The argument was sharp and brutal, echoing off the damp walls of the cave. Gant was putting on his tactical vest, his movements jerky with suppressed rage. Marin stood between him and the exit, her hands spread wide. She told him that challenging Alden was exactly what the Golden Alpha wanted. In Cycle 22, Gant had tried a frontal assault to stop a similar threat. Alden had simply locked him in a stasis field and forced him to watch as the forest burned anyway. History was a trap, and Gant was about to walk right into the teeth of it. Gant stopped, looking down at her. He asked her what the alternative was. He couldn't sit in a cave while his people were incinerated. The desperation in his voice cracked his stoic facade. He felt helpless, a warrior with no enemy he could physically punch. Marin took a breath, forcing her mind to switch from panic to strategy. She accessed the mental library of her deaths, searching for a variable she could exploit. She needed a way to draw Alden out of the palace, away from his stronghold and his ley line amplifiers, without sacrificing the Blackroot pack. She proposed the decoy plan. She explained that Alden was obsessed with possession. He didn't want to kill Marin. He wanted to reclaim her to validate his ascension. If he thought she was surrendering, he would pause the attack. She would turn herself in. Gant exploded at the suggestion, the shadows in the cave flaring as his void magic reacted to his distress. He refused to let her walk back into that monster's hands. He would burn the world down himself before he let Alden touch her again. Marin grabbed his shoulders, shaking him. She wasn't going back as a victim. She was going back as a Trojan horse. She reminded him of the witness claim. Legally, she was still under Gant's jurisdiction until a trial was held. If she surrendered publicly, demanding a tribunal at the neutral ground of the Ascension altar, Alden would be forced by ancient law to accept or risk losing his claim entirely. It would buy them time. While Alden was distracted with the spectacle of her surrender, Gant could infiltrate the Ascension platform from beneath, using the sewers she had mapped out, and plant the remaining explosives on the ley line junction. It was a terrifying gamble. It required Marin to stand defenseless in front of a deranged sorcerer, betting her life on his ego. Gant stared at her, searching for any sign of hesitation. He saw none. He saw a woman who had died 99 times and was finally ready to choose how she lived. Slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her hair, and whispered that if she died, he would tear the timeline apart with his bare hands until he found her again. Marin held him tight, knowing that this might be the last time they touched. The plan was set. It was time to walk back into the lion's den. Chapter 16. The Decoy. The walk to the main gates of the Gilded Ridge stronghold was the longest mile Marin had ever traveled, despite having lived 100 lives. The storm had temporarily abated, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and expectant, like the indrawn breath of a predator before the strike. She wore a coat borrowed from Gant's tactical kit over her tattered wedding dress, a stark visual representation of her dual existence. The bride and the soldier. She kept her hands raised, palms open, a universal gesture of surrender that felt alien to her new resolve. High atop the battlements, the gold-crest snipers tracked her every movement, the red laser dots of their scopes dancing across her chest like angry fireflies. She forced herself to keep her chin up, focusing on the rhythmic crunch of her heels on the gravel, counting the steps to keep her heart rate steady. The massive iron gates groaned open, not to welcome her, but to swallow her whole. A phalanx of guards marched out, flanking Alpha Alden. He looked even worse up close than he had on the broadcast screen. His skin had taken on a gray, papery quality, and the golden light pulsing beneath it seemed to be burning him from the inside out. He didn't look like a ruler. He looked like a vessel cracking under the pressure of its contents. He stopped 10 yards from her, his eyes darting around the perimeter, scanning the shadows for the rival alpha he knew must be lurking nearby. When he found nothing, his gaze snapped back to Marin, filled with a terrifying mixture of relief and manic triumph. He believed he had won. He believed fear had finally brought her back to heel. Marin spoke before he could launch into a monologue, her voice projecting clear and cold across the courtyard. She declared that she was invoking the Tribunal of the Ascension. It was a calculated risk, a legal maneuver that required a public hearing before a mate could be fully claimed or rejected during a holy cycle. Alden stiffened, his jaw working as he processed the challenge. He wanted to drag her inside and lock her in the deepest vault, but the courtyard was filled with his own soldiers and watching civilians. To deny the tribunal would be an admission of fear, a sign of weakness that a fragile alpha could not afford. He let out a harsh, jagged laugh, the sound grating against the silence, and agreed. He sneered that a trial would only serve to prove her incompetence to the pack, unaware that every second he spent gloating was a second Gant used to burrow beneath his feet. Alden signaled the guards, and they moved in, rough hands grabbing Marin's arms. They stripped her of the tactical coat, leaving her shivering in the ruined silk, and marched her through the gates. As they crossed the threshold, Marin risked a single glance toward the storm drain located near the western wall, a grate obscured by overgrown ivy. There was no movement, no shadow, nothing to indicate that the Butcher of Blackroot was there. But she felt it, a subtle drop in temperature, a phantom brush of cold air against her cheek. He was inside. The Trojan horse had breached the walls, and the countdown to the end of the world had officially begun. Chapter 17. The Jailbreak. The holding cell was a damp, windowless cube of stone located in the bowels of the palace, smelling of mildew and old despair. Marin sat on the narrow bench, listening to the drip of water from a leaking pipe, her mind racing through the schematics of the foundation. According to her calculations, Gant should be reaching the main leyline junction directly beneath the Ascension Hall right now. If her math was off, or if Alden had reinforced the substructure in this timeline, the explosives would either fail to detonate or bring the entire castle down on top of them. She closed her eyes, visualizing the timer she had set in her head. 3 minutes. 2 minutes. The waiting was a torture she knew well, but this time, the outcome wasn't a reset. It was finality. The door to the cell swung open with a screech of rusted hinges. Alden stepped in, flanked by 2 mages. He wasn't there for the tribunal. He was there to ensure she understood her place before the cameras started rolling. He paced the small room, his golden energy illuminating the dark corners, casting long, distorted shadows. He ranted about destiny, about how she had forced his hand, about how the destruction of the Blackroot pack would be her fault. He reached out, grabbing her chin, his fingers burning hot against her skin. He hissed that after the ascension, he would bind her to him with blood magic so she could never run again. Marin didn't flinch. She looked him in the eye and whispered that he was assuming he would live that long. Before Alden could react to the insult, the floor lurched violently beneath them. A dull, thumping boom resonated through the stone, shaking dust from the ceiling. The explosion wasn't near the cell. It was deep below, a precision strike on the magical conduits. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into pitch blackness. Alden screamed in rage, his golden aura flaring wildly, blinding in the sudden dark. But before his mages could erect a shield, the shadows in the corner of the cell came alive. They didn't just move, they surged, solidifying into a massive humanoid shape that eclipsed the light of the Alpha. Gant tore through the mages with the efficiency of a hurricane. There was no time for finesse. He threw one against the wall with a sickening crunch and silenced the other with a blow to the throat. Alden, caught off guard and disoriented by the disruption of the ley lines, fired a blast of wild magic, but Gant was already moving. He grabbed Maren, shielding her body with his own as the energy bolt scorched the stone wall behind them. He didn't engage Alden. The goal wasn't to fight him here. He kicked the cell door off its hinges, the metal groaning in protest, and dragged Maren into the chaotic corridor. Alarms blared, a cacophony of ringing bells and magical sirens. They sprinted through the labyrinthine dungeon, the butcher leading the way, leaving a trail of unconscious guards in his wake as they fought their way toward the surface. Chapter 18. If Tomorrow Never Comes. They found a momentary refuge in the dusty, abandoned archives of the West Wing, a section of the palace that had been sealed off for renovations decades ago. The sounds of the chaotic battle raging in the lower levels were muffled here, reduced to a distant rhythmic thumping like the heartbeat of a dying giant. Maren leaned against a towering shelf of rotting scrolls, gasping for breath, while Gant shoved a heavy oak desk against the door to buy them a few minutes. He turned to her, his face streaked with soot and blood, his chest heaving. He checked her over with frantic hands, searching for injuries, his touch lingering on her shoulders, her arms, her face. When he found she was whole, he pulled her into a crushing embrace, burying his face in the crook of her neck. For a long time, they just stood there, holding on to each other in the gloom. This was the quiet before the final storm, the last breath of air before the plunge. Maren closed her eyes, inhaling the scent of him. Rain, iron, and the musk of the void. In the silence, a terrible clarity settled over her. She thought about the glitches, the way reality bent around her survival. She realized with a certainty that settled in her gut like lead that killing Alden might not be enough. The energy fueling the loops was hers. To truly break the cycle, to stop the universe from hitting the reset button the moment things went wrong, the source of the anomaly had to be removed. She had to be willing to not just die, but to cease existing. She pulled back slightly, looking up at Gant. She didn't tell him. She couldn't. If he knew that her plan involved a sacrifice he couldn't prevent, he would lock her in this room and fight the world alone, doomed to fail. Instead, she traced the line of his jaw, memorizing the roughness of his stubble, the intensity of his dark eyes. She told him that she loved him. It was the first time she had said the words in this timeline, though she had felt them for 100 years. Gant's expression softened, the hard lines of the warlord melting away to reveal the man beneath. He kissed her forehead, a gentle, reverent gesture, and promised that they would see the sunrise together. Maren nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She lied with a smile, agreeing that the sunrise would be beautiful. She moved away from him, smoothing the tattered remains of her dress. She picked up a heavy iron candelabra from a nearby table, testing its weight. It wasn't a sword, but it would have to do. She told him it was time. The ascension ceremony was starting. She could feel the pressure in the air changing, the static charge building until the hair on her arm stood up. Gant moved the desk aside, his hand brushing hers one last time. They stepped out of the archives and back into the war, two soldiers marching toward a destiny that only one of them expected to survive. Chapter 19. The Eye of the Storm. The journey from the archives to the Ascension Chapel was a run through a nightmare. The explosion in the foundations had destabilized the castle, causing corridors to collapse and stairwells to twist into impossible Escher-like angles. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the magical fallout. As Alden began the ritual in the chapel, the reality around them began to dissolve. The sky outside the windows had turned a bruised, violent violet, and gravity was becoming a suggestion rather than a law. Debris floated in midair, chunks of stone, shattered glass, furniture, suspended in a zero-gravity field that pulsed in time with the chanting echoing through the halls. They reached the grand courtyard that led to the chapel entrance. It was a war zone. The Blackroot forces had breached the perimeter, clashing with the Gilded Ridge guards in a chaotic melee of fur and fang. But the combatants were struggling to fight as the ground beneath them rippled like water. Maren saw a wolf leap for an enemy only to be frozen in midair, caught in a time eddy. She saw a section of the wall turn into a flock of crows and disperse. The world was unmaking itself. Alden wasn't just ascending. He was pulling the plug on the simulation. Gant grabbed Maren's hand, anchoring her as a wave of nausea rolled over them. They sprinted across the courtyard, dodging floating boulders and arcs of wild lightning. A fissure opened in the ground before them, revealing not earth, but a starry void of nothingness. Gant swung Maren over the gap and leaped after her, his void form flaring to stabilize his momentum. They crashed onto the steps of the chapel, the massive doors looming above them. The wood was groaning, warping under the pressure of the energy inside. Maren grabbed the iron handles. They were hot to the touch, vibrating with power. She looked at Gant. There was no plan B anymore. There was no retreat. He nodded, his eyes turning entirely black as he summoned every ounce of his strength. Together, they heaved the doors open. A blast of wind and blinding light hit them, knocking them back a step. The interior of the chapel was a vortex of gold and white energy, swirling around the altar like a cyclone. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched scream of magic tearing the atmosphere apart. They pushed forward, leaning into the gale, stepping into the eye of the storm where the golden alpha waited to become a god. Chapter 20. Kingslayer. The chapel was no longer a place of worship. It was the epicenter of a cataclysm. The pews had been reduced to splinters, swirling in the golden tornado that dominated the center of the room. The stained glass windows had exploded outward, leaving jagged maws that looked out onto a universe that was rapidly losing its color. In the center of the maelstrom, floating 10 feet above the ruined altar, was Alden. He was unrecognizable. His human form had elongated, his skin shedding to reveal a body made of pure, blinding radiance. He had become a conduit for the Earth's magic, a siphon draining the life force of the territory to fuel his metamorphosis. Gant didn't hesitate. He roared, a sound that cut through the magical shrieking, and launched himself into the air. He shifted mid-leap, becoming a massive spear of darkness, aiming straight for Alden's chest. But Alden simply waved a hand. A wall of solid light slammed into Gant, swatting him out of the air like a fly. Gant crashed into the stone wall with a bone-shattering impact, leaving a crater in the masonry. He fell to the floor, shifting back to human, blood pouring from his nose and ears. The power disparity was absolute. Alden was no longer fighting on a physical plane. He was rewriting the rules of engagement. Maren scrambled over the debris, trying to reach Gant, but the air around her thickened, turning into a viscous gel that slowed her movements to a crawl. Alden turned his gaze toward her. His eyes were gone, replaced by burning pits of white fire. His voice echoed not from his throat, but from the walls, the floor, the sky. He spoke of purification, of a new world order where perfection was the only law. He raised a hand, and Maren felt her feet lift off the ground. She was being dragged toward him, a moth being pulled into a star. She struggled, flailing against the invisible grip, but it was useless. She looked over at Gant. He was trying to rise, his limbs trembling, his void magic flickering weakly. He screamed her name, crawling toward her, scraping his fingers raw on the stone. Maren looked back at Alden. He was drawing her in to consume her, to use her Omega Spark to stabilize his chaotic energy. If he touched her, he would win. He would solidify his power, and the loop would be broken not by freedom, but by eternal tyranny. She realized this was the moment. She couldn't fight him with strength. She had to fight him with the one thing he couldn't absorb, her own volatility. She stopped fighting the pull and let herself drift closer, her hand slipping into the hidden pocket of her dress, her fingers closing around a jagged shard of glass she had picked up in the courtyard. She wasn't going to attack him. She was going to break the vessel. Chapter 21. The Ascension. The sanctuary of the chapel had ceased to exist as a physical space and had become a crucible of blinding, searing radiance. Alden floated above the wreckage of the altar, his body no longer flesh and blood, but a construct of pure, unstable magical energy. He radiated a heat that curled the paint from the walls and turned the rain pouring through the shattered roof into instant steam. He was a supernova contained within the skin of a man, and the pressure he exerted on the room was crushing, forcing Maren to her knees as she tried to crawl toward the epicenter. Gant was already moving, shaking off the concussion of the last impact with a snarl that sounded more beast than human. He didn't care that his opponent was rewriting the laws of physics. He only saw the threat to his mate, and that was enough to drive him into the teeth of the storm. Gant gathered the shadows from the corners of the room, pulling them around himself like a cloak of living armor. He shifted into the void, becoming a jagged silhouette of darkness that drank the light around it. He launched himself at Alden again, this time changing his trajectory in mid-air to avoid the blasts of golden fire. The collision of their energies sent a shockwave through the building that shattered the remaining windows and cracked the stone foundation. It was a battle of absolutes, the unstoppable force of the sun against the immovable object of the abyss. For a moment, the darkness seemed to swallow the light, wrapping around Alden's glowing form and suffocating his flames. But the Golden Alpha simply laughed, a sound that vibrated in Maren's marrow. Alden expanded his aura, detonating a pulse of power that blew Gant backward across the room. The void form shattered, leaving Gant sprawling on the flagstones, his chest heaving and his skin scorched. Alden descended slowly, his feet not touching the ground, his eyes burning with a terrifying lack of humanity. He spoke to them, his voice layered and distorted, echoing from every surface. He proclaimed that resistance was futile because time itself was his servant. He claimed he had seen the loops, seen their pathetic attempts to defy him, and in every iteration, he eventually won. He promised to reset the timeline 1,000 times if that was what it took to break their spirits, to make them understand that his will was the only constant in the universe. Maren clutched the shard of glass in her pocket, her knuckles white. She watched Alden loom over Gant, preparing to deliver a blow that would vaporize him. She realized then that Alden didn't understand the mechanism of his own power. He thought he was the master of the loop, but he was just the parasite feeding on it. He believed he was ascending to a higher state of being, but he was merely bloating himself on magic he couldn't control. He was a bomb waiting for a detonator. Maren forced herself to stand, fighting the gravity that tried to pin her to the floor. She screamed his name, her voice raw and defiant, drawing his attention away from the wounded Alpha. Alden turned to her, his expression twisting into a sneer of triumph, believing she was finally ready to beg. He didn't see the weapon in her hand, nor did he see the resolve in her eyes that was colder and sharper than any blade. Chapter 22. The final death Maren stepped into the circle of raw magic that swirled around Alden, the force of it tearing at her clothes and stinging her skin like 1,000 angry hornets. To anyone else, this energy field would be lethal, stripping the flesh from their bones in seconds. But Maren walked through it, untouched. The universe recognized her. The timeline bent around her because she was its linchpin. She stopped 3 feet from the floating Alpha, close enough to feel the radiation of his power, close enough to see the madness fracturing his gaze. Alden extended a hand, expecting her to take it, expecting her to submit and stabilize his chaotic ascension with her grounding presence. He needed her to be the anchor that kept his new reality from tearing apart. Instead of taking his hand, Maren looked him in the eye and spoke the truth she had been hiding for 100 lifetimes. She told him that the loop wasn't his power. It wasn't his magic that reset the clock every time the world ended. It was hers. She explained that her survival instinct was so catastrophic, so absolute, that it refused to let her die, dragging the entire world back to the start line just to give her another chance. Alden froze, the golden light flickering uncertainly as doubt crept into his megalomania. He tried to dismiss her, to laugh it off, but the air around them began to hum with a discordant frequency. The reality of the chapel started to glitch again, the walls flickering between stone and dust, confirming her words. Marin withdrew the shard of glass from her pocket. She didn't aim it at him. She pressed the jagged edge against her own palm, hard enough to draw a bead of bright red blood. She told him that to break the loop, she didn't need to kill him. She needed to convince the universe that she was done. She had to lower the shield she didn't even know she had been holding up. She closed her eyes and focused on the core of her being, on the terrified, stubborn part of her soul that had been screaming "live" for a century. She commanded it to stop. She let go of the fear. She let go of the need to see tomorrow. She offered herself to the void, not as a victim, but as a sacrifice. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The protective bubble of probability that had surrounded Marin collapsed. The raw magic of the ascension, no longer held back by her subconscious will, slammed into her with the force of a freight train. She gasped as the energy tore through her, burning her nerves and stopping her heart. But as she fell, Alden screamed. Without her as the stabilizer, the massive influx of power he had absorbed turned against him. His golden form began to crack, fissures of black light spreading across his skin. He reached for her, desperate to re-establish the connection, but it was too late. The anchor was gone, and the ship was drifting straight into the hurricane. Marin hit the floor, her vision fading to gray, watching the tyrant unravel. Chapter 23. Breaking the glass. Alden was disintegrating. His screams were not of pain, but of existential terror as the magic he had hoarded began to consume him from the inside out. Beams of uncontrolled energy shot from his eyes and mouth, slicing through the stone walls of the chapel like lasers. He thrashed in the air, a dying star collapsing under its own gravity. But he was still dangerous, still a volatile entity capable of taking the entire mountain range with him in his death throes. He was trying to trigger a manual reset, clawing at the fabric of time with glowing hands, trying to force the day to start over. For a terrifying second, the world flickered, gray, then color, then gray again. The loop was trying to engage, fighting against the finality of death. Gant did not let it happen. He rose from the debris, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, his eyes fixed on the crumbling monster above him. He didn't shift into a wolf. There was no time. He drew on the deepest reserves of his void nature, the anomaly that allowed him to exist outside the flow of time. He didn't throw a punch. He threw himself. He leaped through the chaotic whirlwind of energy, tackling Alden out of the air. His darkness wrapped around the golden light, smothering it, containing the explosion within the cage of his own body. They crashed to the altar, shattering the stone slab. Gant pinned Alden down, his hands gripping the Alpha's throat. Alden thrashed, burning Gant's flesh with his touch, but the butcher did not let go. He channeled the void directly into Alden's core, a flood of absolute nothingness to drown the sun. With a final guttural roar, Gant snapped the connection. There was a sound like a thunderclap inside a jar, and then the light simply vanished. Alden's body went limp, the golden glow fading to a dull, lifeless gray. The storm outside ceased instantly. The floating debris crashed to the floor. Silence reclaimed the chapel, heavy and absolute. Gant scrambled off the corpse and crawled frantically toward Marin. She was lying still on the flagstones, her skin pale, her chest motionless. The magic had stopped, but the cost had been paid. She was slipping away, the tether to life severed. Gant gathered her into his arms, rocking back and forth, a low, keening sound ripping from his throat. He refused to accept it. He placed his hand over her heart and pushed his own energy into her. Not light, not darkness, but the sheer, stubborn will of his existence. He used his status as an anchor to hold her soul in place, physically pinning her spirit to her body, defying the natural order that demanded her death. He whispered to her, commanding her to stay, begging her not to leave him alone in a world she had saved. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing. Then, a single ragged breath shuddered through her frame. Chapter 24. The 101st day. The sound was rhythmic and annoying. Beep, beep, beep. It was distinct from the buzzing of an alarm clock, sharper and more clinical. Marin frowned, her eyelids feeling like they were weighted with lead. Her first thought was a weary resignation. Cycle 101. She expected to smell hairspray and lilies. She expected to hear her mother's voice and the rattle of the door handle. She prepared herself to open her eyes and see the sun at a 45-degree angle, to start the script all over again. The exhaustion was so profound she almost wanted to cry, but she didn't have the strength. Then she smelled it. Not lilies, not chemicals, antiseptic, old coffee. And underneath it all, the scent of rain and deep, earthy musk. Marin's eyes flew open. She wasn't in her bedroom. She was in a room with sterile white walls and machines that monitored her vitals. She turned her head, pain flaring in her stiff neck, and saw the window. The sun was shining, but it was high in the sky, streaming in through blinds that were definitely not the ones in her parents' house. She stared at the digital clock on the wall. The red numbers burned into her retinas. 8:01 a.m. But the date was wrong. It was the day after the wedding. A sob trapped in her throat, choking her. She tried to sit up, but a heavy weight on her hand stopped her. She looked down. Gant was asleep in a plastic chair pulled right up to the bedside, his upper body slumped onto the mattress. His head rested near her hip, his hand gripping hers so tightly his knuckles were white, even in sleep. He looked terrible, bruised, bandaged, dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a vigil held for days. But he was breathing. His chest rose and fell in a steady, reassuring rhythm that proved he was real, that this moment was real. Marin squeezed his hand, her fingers weak but determined. Gant jerked awake instantly, his head snapping up, his eyes wide and panicked. When he saw her looking at him, the terror in his face melted into an expression of such raw, overwhelming relief that it broke her heart. He didn't say a word. He just buried his face in her palm, his shoulders shaking with silent tremors. Marin ran her other hand through his messy hair, feeling the warmth of him, the solid, undeniable truth of his presence. They had done it. The loop was broken. The script was burned. For the first time in 100 lifetimes, Marin Vance didn't know what was going to happen next. And as she looked at the man who had walked through hell to bring her here, she realized that the unknown was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. And finally, the sun rose on a new day. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Marin and Alpha Gant as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow, and if you aren't part of our pack yet, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next adventure. I read every single comment, so I want to hear from you. Where in the world did you listen from today? And, more importantly, what was your favorite scene? Was it the deer crossing, the heist, or that final battle in the chapel? Let me know down below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.